The studio lights burned bright against the navy blue backdrop, casting long shadows over the debate stage where power and pride collided. Mark Levin leaned back in his chair with a smirk that was equal parts arrogance and amusement. "Remind me again," he said, voice dripping with disdain. "Where exactly did you get that law degree, Congresswoman? Was it from a cereal box?" The audience erupted into a wave of nervous chuckles. Cameras zoomed in on Jasmine Crockett's face, searching for a crack in her composure. There was none. She sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on Levin with a steady, almost surgical calm. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Levin pressed on, sensing blood. "I mean, really, you and your so-called legal expertise, do you even understand the Constitution you swore an oath to?" His words slithered through the air, each one calibrated to humiliate. It was the kind of mockery he had perfected over decades, ridicule dressed as analysis, condescension wrapped in constitutional rhetoric. A ripple of agreement moved through a corner of the crowd. Crockett's critics nodded, smiling at the spectacle. But elsewhere, the room shifted uneasily. Viewers at home took to their phones, clips already slicing across social media. "Levin destroys Crockett," one trending post read. "Congresswoman humiliated on air," said another. Still, Crockett didn't flinch. Behind that measured silence was a story Levin had underestimated. Years of legal battles fought in packed courtrooms. Clients defended when no one else would stand beside them, and a lifetime of being doubted simply because of who she was. "Cat got your tongue?" Levin sneered again, leaning forward now, emboldened by her silence. "Or is this just above your legal pay grade?" Another round of laughter. Another attempt to belittle. Crockett inhaled slowly, her hands folding neatly on the table. Her gaze never left Levin's face. If he looked closely, he might have seen it. The faintest glimmer in her eyes, not of anger, but of resolve. The crowd sensed it too. The laughter grew quieter. The air grew heavier. Something was shifting. And then, in a voice calm enough to freeze the room, she opened her mouth to speak. What happened next left the entire room stunned, and Levin speechless. This was never just about a law degree. It wasn't even about a single debate stage or a sharp-tongued commentator trying to score points on live television. Beneath the bright lights and biting sarcasm, a much deeper story was unfolding, one that touched the very heart of America's identity crisis. For decades, the tension had been simmering. The clash between expertise and arrogance, substance and spectacle, respect and ridicule. Levin's words were more than a personal insult. They echoed a familiar, exhausting pattern, the way power often seeks to delegitimize those who weren't born into it. And for women like Jasmine Crockett, especially women of color, the battle had always been steeper, harsher, and far more public. To one half of the audience, Levin was just doing what he always did, poking holes, challenging authority, playing the role of the sharp-edged skeptic. But to the other half, his mockery landed differently. It was the sneer they'd heard in job interviews, the condescension that shadowed their accomplishments, the implication that no matter how hard they worked, they didn't belong. Crockett knew that look. She had seen it in courtrooms when opposing counsel underestimated her. She had felt it in congressional hearings when male colleagues interrupted or talked over her. And now, she was facing it again on national television. Not just for herself, but for millions watching who had fought the same battles in quieter rooms. Levin, meanwhile, was enjoying the theater. He gestured broadly, soaking in the laughter that rippled from the crowd. "This is what happens," he declared, "when you hand out law degrees like participation trophies." He chuckled at his own punchline. The message was clear. Crockett didn't deserve to be here. But as the cameras panned back to her, the contrast couldn't have been starker. Where Levin's posture screamed swagger and superiority, Crockett's was still, composed, deliberate. It wasn't weakness, it was calculation. She wasn't retreating. She was waiting. Outside the studio, the digital world was already catching fire. Within minutes, hashtags like Dai Levin vs. Crockett and law degree debate were trending. Clips of the insult looped across Twitter and TikTok, dissected in comment threads and reaction videos. Some mocked her. Others rallied behind her. "We've all been Jasmine Crockett," one viral post read. "Calm while they laugh, silent while they underestimate." And yet this wasn't just about identity politics or media narratives. It was about something bigger. Who gets to define expertise in America? Who gets to decide what credentials mean? Who is granted respect in public life? And who has to demand it, over and over again? The stakes were suddenly much higher than a single jab on a talk show. Levin, knowingly or not, had stepped into a cultural minefield, and Crockett, by refusing to take the bait too soon, was shifting the terrain beneath his feet. As the minutes ticked by, tension wrapped itself around the room. Even the laughter from Levin's supporters began to waver, sensing that her silence was not surrender but strategy. The audience leaned forward. Commentators online debated what she might say. News outlets queued up their think pieces before she had even spoken a word. And somewhere deep inside that studio, even Levin began to feel the weight of the moment he'd created. Because this was no ordinary exchange. It was about power, who wields it, who earns it, and who tries to mock it into submission. Jasmine Crockett lifted her eyes, unblinking, steady as stone. The storm that had been building behind her silence was about to break. But this was no ordinary exchange. This would become a flashpoint watched by millions. And what she was about to say next would change the entire trajectory of the debate. To understand the venom behind Mark Levin's words that night, you have to understand the man behind the smirk. Mark Reed Levin wasn't just another political commentator shouting into the void. He was a fixture of America's conservative media machine. A lawyer by training, a radio heavyweight by reputation, and a provocateur by instinct, Levin had built a career on his ability to rile, ridicule, and rally. His followers called him a truth-teller. His critics called him a bully. And both, in their own way, were right. Levin's rise began not in the media spotlight, but in the labyrinth of Washington's conservative legal circles. He had served as chief of staff to Attorney General Edwin Meese during the Reagan administration, immersing himself in the ideological battles of the 1980s. He understood the Constitution, not just as a legal text but as a political weapon, one he wielded with precision against anyone he deemed unworthy of interpreting. When he transitioned to talk radio, Levin brought that same combative edge to the airwaves. His show wasn't designed for quiet contemplation or polite debate. It was theater. Thunderous monologues, scathing takedowns, relentless mockery. He thrived on confrontation, and the more explosive the clash, the higher his ratings soared. His brand was built on spectacle, and yet, beneath the booming voice and the constitutional citations, there was a pattern, one that critics had long pointed out. Levin, for all his legal expertise, often reserved his harshest attacks not for corrupt officials or constitutional abuses, but for individuals whose very presence in power seemed to offend him. Women, people of color, immigrants, anyone who challenged the traditional molds of authority. It wasn't always overt. Sometimes it was a throwaway joke about a Latina congresswoman's emotional testimony. Other times, a mocking dismissal of a young black attorney's credentials. But the subtext was consistent. Certain people, in Levin's view, were perpetually on trial. Their worthiness questioned no matter how many degrees hung on their walls or how many laws they had written. Ironically, Levin himself was a lawyer, armed with a Juris Doctor from Temple University's Beasley School of Law. He had argued cases, advised officials, and lectured endlessly about the sanctity of legal institutions. And yet here he was, ridiculing someone else's legal education, as if the courtroom were his exclusive domain. That contradiction didn't bother him. In fact, it was part of his strategy. Levin understood the optics of dominance. By diminishing others, he elevated himself. His fans ate it up. They loved the sharpness of his tongue, the way he reduced complex debates into memorable sound bites. To them, Levin wasn't just a commentator. He was a warrior against what they saw as the creeping liberal orthodoxy. And if that meant shredding reputations on live television, so be it. But even among conservatives, Levin's approach had drawn criticism. Some legal scholars accused him of cheapening discourse, of weaponizing his credentials against those who disagreed. Others pointed to the irony of a man who preached respect for institutions while ridiculing those who had earned their place within them. Still, Levin remained undeterred. The outrage was part of the formula. Every angry headline, every trending hashtag only made his voice louder. He had mastered the cycle: provoke, enrage, dominate, repeat. And so, when he sneered at Jasmine Crockett's law degree that night, it wasn't a spontaneous jab. It was muscle memory. He'd done this before. Many times, he had mocked seasoned prosecutors, belittled professors, even questioned the intelligence of federal judges. And each time, the spectacle boosted his profile and deepened his following. But what Levin hadn't accounted for, what he never truly prepared for, was someone who wouldn't just endure his mockery, but weaponize it against him. Crockett was not a rookie. Before Congress, she had spent years in the trenches of Texas courtrooms, defending the voiceless and challenging power at every turn. Her credentials weren't decorative. They were forged in the heat of real battles. And unlike many of Levin's past targets, she wasn't about to shrink under the weight of his sneers. As the seconds ticked by and she remained silent, Levin misread it as surrender. He mistook composure for weakness, patience for fear. It was the same mistake he had made before. But this time, the cost would be far higher. Because while Levin believed he was playing another familiar round of his game, provoke, enrage, dominate, Crockett was quietly rewriting the rules, and the audience, both in the studio and across millions of screens, could feel it. Something was different this time. The tension felt heavier, the silence more charged. Levin had mocked countless people before, but this wasn't going to end like those times, because Mark Levin had never faced someone quite like Jasmine Crockett. Long before she sat beneath the blinding lights of a televised debate, Jasmine Crockett knew what it felt like to be underestimated. She had felt it as a little girl growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, a city bursting with pride and pain, where the American dream often seemed to come with conditions. Her parents, working class and unyielding, taught her early on that dignity wasn't something handed to you. It was something you carved out of struggle. It was something you protected, even when the world tried to strip it away. From a young age, Crockett had questions. Too many, some teachers complained. Why were certain neighborhoods ignored by city officials? Why did justice seem to come quicker for some than for others? She watched as friends and neighbors were pulled into cycles of poverty and policing that seemed designed to break them. And instead of turning away, she leaned closer. She read everything she could about the law, the Constitution, and the system that shaped the lives around her. When she entered college, it wasn't with a safety net or a family name that opened doors. It was grit that carried her forward. She juggled jobs, endured skepticism, and brushed off the patronizing smiles that said, "People like you don't make it that far." But she did. And when she walked across the stage to collect her law degree, it wasn't just a diploma in her hand. It was a declaration. I belong here. I've earned this. Her early years as an attorney were far from glamorous. She didn't chase corporate clients or high-paying firms. Instead, she stepped into crowded courtrooms on behalf of those the system often forgot. The wrongly accused, the underrepresented, the people for whom justice was a privilege rather than a promise. She stood beside young men facing decades for minor offenses, mothers fighting for custody, immigrants terrified of losing everything. Those battles shaped her. They toughened her voice, sharpened her resolve, and taught her the value of composure under fire. Judges questioned her abilities. Opposing counsel tried to rattle her. Some even laughed when she walked into the courtroom. But each insult, each attempt to diminish her, only forged her deeper resilience. She learned how to disarm arrogance not with rage but with precision, how to slice through prejudice with fact, law, and unwavering dignity. It was that same spirit that propelled her into politics. Crockett had seen too many decisions made by people who had never set foot in the neighborhoods they governed. She had watched lawmakers speak of justice while ignoring the very people who needed it most. So she decided to step forward, not because she craved the spotlight, but because silence was no longer an option. Her campaign for Congress was a battle in itself. She faced skeptics at every turn, pundits who dismissed her as too inexperienced, donors who suggested she tone down her message, and opponents who questioned her qualifications. But Crockett didn't bend. She knocked on doors until her knuckles ached. She listened to stories from people who had long stopped believing anyone in Washington cared. And she spoke not in polished sound bites, but in truths drawn from lived experience. When she won her seat, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a testament to every person who had ever been told they were too loud, too bold, too unqualified. Crockett carried them with her into the halls of Congress, the single mothers, the underpaid workers, the overlooked dreamers. And she carried with her the lessons she had learned in those early courtrooms. Stay calm, stay grounded, and let the facts speak louder than the insults. That was why, on that debate stage, her silence wasn't weakness. It was wisdom, the kind forged not in comfort but in adversity. Mark Levin saw a congresswoman sitting still, but what he didn't see were the battles she had already fought and won long before this night. He didn't see the nights spent preparing legal briefs on too little sleep, the clients who cried in gratitude after walking free, or the relentless drive that turned skepticism into respect. Every insult she'd ever endured had prepared her for this moment. Every time someone had tried to belittle her achievements, she had turned it into fuel. Every sneer and sideways glance had taught her to hold her ground with grace. So when Levin mocked her law degree, he wasn't just mocking a credential. He was mocking a lifetime of struggle, sacrifice, and triumph he could never fully comprehend. And that is why she didn't flinch. That is why her eyes didn't waver. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't sitting there to defend a resume. She was there to defend the principle that no one, no matter how loud, no matter how credentialed, had the right to diminish someone else's worth. The crowd couldn't know all of this as they watched her sit in silence. They couldn't see the decades of work that had led her to that chair. But they felt something shift. They sensed that this wasn't going to be another clip where the loudest voice won. This was something deeper, a reckoning born from resilience. And as Levin prepared to deliver yet another jab, confident he had the upper hand, Jasmine Crockett lifted her head slightly, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. The storm he had invited was about to arrive, and when it did, it wouldn't just change the tone of that debate. It would change the entire balance of power in the room. The silence that followed Crockett's steady gaze was brief. Too brief for Mark Levin's liking. He shifted in his seat, leaning forward as if determined to break it. "You know," he began, his tone taking on a performative lightness, "I've reviewed quite a few legal arguments in my time. Some brilliant, some laughable, and I have to say, Congresswoman, the idea that you represent the pinnacle of legal scholarship?" He paused for effect, letting the smirk crawl back across his face. "Well, that's generous." A few scattered laughs broke out from the audience, the kind that carry more cruelty than humor. Levin sensed he had them again, and he pressed harder. "Let's be honest. Your courtroom resume is thinner than a freshman's term paper. Did you handle any cases that didn't end with a plea deal?" He raised an eyebrow, theatrically flipping through imaginary papers on the table. "Because I'm struggling to find anything resembling a landmark legal victory in your background." The camera cut to Crockett. Her expression hadn't changed. Not a flinch, not a blink. Just that same calm, unshaken presence. Levin laughed lightly, clearly amused by her stillness. "See, this is what I mean. You have the degree, sure. But where's the substance? Where's the brilliance? Where's the evidence that you're anything more than a talking point dressed up as a lawyer?" Another round of chuckles rippled through the room. But this time they didn't carry the same confidence as before. Some faces in the crowd were turning thoughtful, even uneasy. They noticed how Crockett's silence wasn't shrinking her. It was shrinking him. Every sarcastic barb he threw seemed to bounce harmlessly off her composure, while his own tone grew sharper, more desperate. And beyond the studio walls, the internet was exploding. Clips of Levin's mockery hit social media within seconds. On Twitter, the hashtags #Crockett clapback and Levin mockery surged to the top of trending lists. One viral post read, "This man is really out here trying to bully a civil rights attorney on live TV." Another countered, "Levin's destroying her. Why isn't she saying anything?" The digital battlefield mirrored the tension in the room, half expecting Crockett to fold, half praying for the storm to come. Levin, oblivious or unwilling to see the tide turning, went for one final blow. "Let me put it this way," he said, leaning closer, lowering his V, "Congresswoman, I'm just not convinced you know the difference." Voice like a professor lecturing a student. There's a difference between being a lawyer and being a good lawyer. And frankly, the words hung heavy in the air. The room, moments ago filled with snickers, grew noticeably quieter. Even Levin seemed to notice the shift, the way the energy had stopped laughing with him and started holding its breath. And still, Jasmine Crockett did not rise to the bait. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't fire back impulsively, didn't even reach for her microphone. She simply inhaled, slow and measured, as if weighing something greater than the insult in front of her. What Levin, and many in that room, failed to understand was that this was not hesitation. It was strategy. Crockett knew that the longer she let him talk, the more rope he'd hand himself. She knew that every jab he delivered in arrogance would make her eventual words cut deeper. It was the same lesson she had learned in those courtrooms years ago. Don't interrupt a man who's digging his own grave. Even the moderator, sensing the temperature of the room rising, cleared his throat. "Congresswoman Crockett, would you like to respond?" he asked. She didn't move immediately. Instead, she lifted her eyes from the table and met Levin's stare head-on. In that moment, something shifted. The smirk faltered just slightly. The room seemed to lean in closer, breathless and waiting. Crockett adjusted the microphone in front of her, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She sat back in her chair, spine straight, resolve carved into every line of her face. The insults had piled high. The arrogance had been laid bare, and now, the moment she had been waiting for was finally here. Then, with a quiet breath and a razor-sharp gaze, she began. She let the silence stretch, a deliberate beat that made every heart in the room pound a little harder. Then Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone, her voice calm, but carrying the unmistakable edge of someone who has waited long enough. "Mark," she began, her tone deceptively gentle. "I've listened patiently while you tried to belittle my education, my work, and my record. And I have to say, it's fascinating watching someone so desperate to tear others down just to feel tall." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Levin shifted in his chair, his smirk flickering, but he said nothing. Crockett wasn't finished. "You see," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word, "I didn't grow up with your connections or your platform. I didn't inherit a career from someone else's network. I built mine in courtrooms where people's lives were on the line, and those plea deals you mock, they were for mothers trying to keep their children, for young men targeted because of the color of their skin, for families caught in a system that treats poverty like a crime." Gasps and quiet nods rippled across the audience. Levin tried to interject, but Crockett raised a hand, never taking her eyes off him. "No, let me finish. You want to talk about substance? I spent years standing in front of judges who doubted me before I said a single word. I had to be twice as prepared, twice as sharp, just to be heard. And I was heard. I won cases that mattered. Not because they made headlines, but because they saved lives." The crowd was leaning in now, every word tightening the coil of tension. Levin's trademark smirk was gone, replaced by a strained half-smile that looked more like a grimace. Crockett paused, letting the moment breathe before going for the heart of his argument. "You love to measure brilliance by courtroom theatrics and public victories. But let's talk about the Constitution. You know, that document you and I both swore to uphold. The 6th Amendment guarantees the right to counsel. The 14th guarantees equal protection under the law. That means defending the vulnerable isn't just noble, it's foundational. And if you think that work is beneath you, maybe you've forgotten what the law is actually for." A collective "ooh" swept through the room. Someone in the back even clapped before catching themselves. Levin shifted again, clearing his throat, but Crockett pressed on. "And let's not rewrite history here," she said, her voice now cutting with surgical precision. "You, Mark, built an entire career critiquing the very government institutions you claim to revere. You've mocked judges, undermined prosecutors, and dismissed entire legal arguments as nonsense when they don't align with your politics. That's not scholarship. That's performance." Laughter bubbled from the crowd, the kind that stings when you're on the receiving end. Levin opened his mouth, but Crockett didn't give him the space. "You question my credentials, but you know exactly what threatens you. That someone who doesn't look like you, doesn't sound like you, and doesn't bow to you, can hold her own in this arena. That's why you're here swinging wildly instead of debating ideas." The audience roared, applause breaking out like a thunderclap, drowning out Levin's attempted rebuttal. His lips moved, but no words came. "And here's the irony," Crockett added, her voice now softer but somehow even more powerful. "I became a lawyer not to win the approval of pundits, but to fight for people who've been told they don't belong. People who've been laughed at, talked over, dismissed, just like you tried to do to me today. And the thing about people like us? We don't need your validation. Our work speaks louder than your mockery ever could." The room erupted again. Cheers, applause, even a few people rising to their feet. Levin sat frozen, gripping the arms of his chair. But Crockett wasn't done. Her next words landed like precision strikes. "You called my accomplishments generous. Well, let me tell you something generous. The patience it takes to stand here and explain why public defense, civil rights work, and fighting systemic injustice isn't a footnote. It's the front line of American law. It's the very definition of justice. And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's because deep down, you know that your version of the law serves power, while mine serves people." The applause now was deafening. The moderator tried to regain control, but the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Crockett, once the target of ridicule, now commanded the stage with an authority that Levin could neither match nor interrupt. She turned back to him one last time, her gaze unwavering. "You asked where my brilliance is, Mark. It's not in showboating or self-promotion. It's in the families reunited, the rights restored, the lives rebuilt. That's the substance you couldn't see, and the substance you fear most." Levin swallowed hard, his trademark bravado slipping. "Well," he stammered, "that's certainly one perspective." Crockett leaned back slightly, her expression serene. "No, Mark," she said, her voice like tempered steel. "That's the law, and that's the truth." The studio fell into a stunned silence, the kind that stretches long after the words have stopped. Even those who had laughed at Levin's jabs now sat still, as if unsure whether they'd just witnessed a debate or a reckoning. Social media, meanwhile, was detonating. Clips of Crockett's counterattack rocketed across platforms. She ended him, one viral post read, "This is how you dismantle arrogance with facts." Hashtags that had mocked her minutes before now chanted her name. Even commentators who had previously dismissed her were forced to acknowledge what had just unfolded. Levin sat there, visibly rattled. Every attempt at a comeback fizzled under the weight of her words. For once, the man known for dominating debates and steamrolling opponents found himself without a script. Crockett, sensing that the point had been made, offered a final line, not as a jab but as a statement of principle. "This isn't about me," she said, addressing the audience now. "It's about what kind of country we want to be. One where credentials are dismissed because of who holds them, or one where justice is measured by the lives we lift up. I know which side I'm on." A standing ovation followed. Cameras zoomed in on Levin's face, flushed, tight-lipped, his earlier confidence reduced to silence. Across the stage, Jasmine Crockett stood calm and steady, the embodiment of everything he had tried and failed to diminish. And as the crowd's cheers rolled on, one truth became undeniable. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a turning point, one that would be replayed, debated, and remembered long after the lights dimmed. And that was only the beginning of the shockwaves. The room was still vibrating from the force of Jasmine Crockett's takedown when the first tweets began to fly. Seconds after the cameras stopped rolling, lawyers shot to the top of trending lists, fueled by a wave of disbelief, celebration, and vindication that spread like wildfire across social media. One viral clip of Crockett saying, "Our work speaks louder than your mockery ever could," racked up 1 million views in under an hour. Another, the moment Levin's smirk dissolved into stunned silence, became an instant meme, captioned simply, "Silenced." Commentators from across the spectrum scrambled to weigh in. Progressive outlets hailed the exchange as a defining moment for women of color in public life. "What we witnessed wasn't just a rebuttal," tweeted MSNBC's Joy Reid. "It was a masterclass in composure and constitutional literacy. Crockett didn't just win, she rewrote the terms of engagement." Even traditionally centrist voices chimed in. Levin's usual steamrolling met its match, wrote a Washington Post columnist. And the power dynamic of political debate may never look quite the same. Clips flooded TikTok and Instagram reels. Crockett's calm dismantling of Levin's mockery set to dramatic orchestral music, intercut with quotes about justice and perseverance. One creator stitched her line about defending the vulnerable with historical footage of civil rights lawyers, calling her the modern-day heir to a legacy of legal warriors. Others highlighted her immigrant-friendly message, celebrating her as proof that resilience and service matter more than pedigree. Meanwhile, Levin was facing a firestorm. The same conservative circles that once cheered his takedowns were now split. Some doubled down, accusing Crockett of playing the victim card, but others openly questioned his approach. Mocking someone's credentials instead of debating their ideas is beneath you, wrote a longtime fan on X. You looked rattled, and that's not the Levin we know. The cracks in his once impenetrable base were small but visible. Cable news seized on the moment. CNN ran a primetime segment titled The Clapback Heard Across America, replaying Crockett's words alongside a panel dissecting their cultural weight. One commentator noted, this wasn't just about a law degree. It was about respect, about who gets to be seen as legitimate in our institutions. Crockett flipped the script on decades of dismissive rhetoric in under 5 minutes. Even late-night hosts joined the chorus. On The Daily Show, the audience roared as the host replayed Levin's stunned silence on a loop. Mark Levin's Wi-Fi must have gone out mid-argument, he joked. Someone check his connection. The laughter masked a deeper truth. For the first time in years, Levin had lost control of the narrative, and everyone knew it. But perhaps the most powerful reaction came not from pundits, but from ordinary people. A young law student posted a tearful video saying Crockett's words had inspired her to keep pursuing public defense despite relentless doubt. Immigrant parents shared stories of their children watching the debate and saying, "She looks like us." Community organizers used the moment as a rallying cry, reminding followers that dignity and expertise belong to everyone, not just those born into privilege. The impact rippled far beyond the studio walls. In classrooms, professors referenced Crockett's response as a case study in rhetorical strategy and constitutional grounding. Advocacy groups cited her defense of the 6th and 14th Amendments as a blueprint for humanizing the law. Even political strategists admitted, off the record, that this single exchange had shifted how debates would be prepared going forward. No one's underestimating Jasmine Crockett again, one strategist told Politico. She's not just a rising star, she's a new standard. Levin tried damage control. He released a statement insisting his comments were misinterpreted and that he had great respect for public defenders. But the tone rang hollow. The clip of his original sneer, "Generous accomplishments, I suppose?" had already taken on a life of its own, replayed millions of times with captions mocking his condescension. The more he tried to downplay the incident, the more his defensiveness fueled the narrative that Crockett had exposed a deeper insecurity. And yet, for all the chaos swirling online, Crockett herself remained characteristically composed. In a brief interview the next morning, she brushed off the viral frenzy. "It's not about who shouted loudest," she said. "It's about who stood for something real." That single line was clipped, shared, and celebrated as the moral heart of the entire confrontation. By week's end, the numbers told the story. Over 50 million views across platforms, thousands of op-eds and reaction videos, and a surge in donations to legal aid organizations Crockett had championed during her career. What began as a petty insult had morphed into something much larger, a national conversation about expertise, identity, and respect in American democracy. Even those who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before now knew her name. And for millions watching, her poised demolition of Levin's arrogance wasn't just satisfying, it was personal. It felt like vindication for every time they'd been dismissed, doubted, or diminished. But this was more than a viral moment. As one commentator put it, Crockett didn't just silence a critic, she redefined what strength looks like in American politics. And as the dust settled, one thing became clear. She hadn't just won an argument. She had reframed the conversation about power itself. In the days following the debate, as clips of Jasmine Crockett's dismantling of Mark Levin continued to dominate feeds and fuel conversations. She stepped back into the public eye with a message that transcended the viral spectacle. Standing before a crowd at a town hall in her district, she spoke not about Levin by name, but about something far bigger, the meaning of dignity in a world too often defined by arrogance. "People keep telling me I won that debate," she began, her tone steady, warm, and deeply grounded. "But I don't think about it as a win or a loss. What happened that night wasn't about scoring points. It was about reminding people that our worth is not determined by someone else's mockery." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. "When someone tries to reduce you to a punchline," she continued, "it says more about their fear than your value. Because arrogance is loud, insecurity is loud. But dignity? Dignity doesn't need to shout. It speaks for itself." It was a sentiment that struck a deep chord. Across the country, people who had watched the exchange replayed her words and saw themselves reflected in them. The student told she wasn't smart enough. The immigrant told to go back. The woman of color whose expertise was questioned in every meeting. Crockett had transformed an insult meant to diminish her into a beacon for anyone who had ever been underestimated. She went further, tying the lesson back to the fabric of the nation itself. "The promise of America," she said, "has never been about perfection. It's about perseverance. It's about people who look different, speak differently, worship differently, stepping into rooms that weren't built for them and refusing to leave. It's about making space where there was none. That's the work. That's the fight." The crowd erupted in applause, but Crockett wasn't finished. She spoke of the long arc of justice, of lawyers who fought Jim Crow in hostile courtrooms, of women who argued before all-male benches, of immigrants who studied law at night after long days of labor. "I stand on the shoulders of those who came before me," she said. "And if my presence in that debate made even one young girl believe that she, too, belongs at the table, then that's more important than any insult ever thrown my way." Her words were not just a reflection on her own experience, but a challenge to the culture that had allowed such dismissiveness to thrive. "We need to stop confusing cruelty with strength," she declared. "Strength is not sneering at someone's achievements. Strength is lifting others up while you climb. Strength is knowing that when we all rise, this country becomes stronger too." By the time she finished, the applause was thunderous. Reporters covering the event described the atmosphere as more akin to a movement rally than a political speech. Hashtags shifted from the lawyered to dignity wins. Editorials praised her not only for her debate performance, but for how she had turned a fleeting viral moment into a deeper national conversation about respect, representation, and resilience. Even some of Levin's critics admitted they were surprised by her restraint. She had every opportunity to gloat, to mock him in return. Instead, she had chosen the higher ground, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And in doing so, she offered a vision of leadership rooted not in ego, but in empathy. The cultural resonance continued to build. High school debate teams analyzed her rhetorical strategy. Law professors assigned her remarks as reading on the power of narrative framing. Civic groups launched campaigns celebrating dignity over derision. What had started as a single heated exchange now lived on as a broader testament to the kind of discourse many Americans longed for, and as Crockett left the stage that night, the cheers still echoing behind her, one truth rang louder than all the rest. That arrogance may dominate the microphone for a moment, but dignity endures. It grows louder with each person who refuses to be diminished, with each voice that rises where silence once reigned. In a system built to silence some voices, hers rang louder than ever. Mark Levin mocked her law degree, questioned her intelligence, and tried to reduce her life's work to a punchline. But Jasmine Crockett didn't just respond. She silenced the room. What began as a sneer ended as a standing ovation, a viral reckoning, and a powerful reminder that arrogance crumbles in the face of unshakable dignity. Moments like this are bigger than politics. They're about who we are as a country, about whether we reward cruelty or celebrate courage, whether we sneer at resilience or stand up for it. Crockett's story isn't just her own. It belongs to anyone who's ever been underestimated and still rose higher. And here's the truth. This was just one battle in a much larger war over respect, power, and justice in America. Every day, new confrontations unfold, in Congress, in courtrooms, on live television, that shape the soul of this nation. And you deserve to see them not as headlines, but as stories that matter. If you believe dignity still matters in American politics, if you believe arrogance should always be held accountable, if you believe the fight for equality and justice is worth watching unfold, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to Liberty Leak right now for daily political drama, viral confrontations, and epic stories of justice served. Join a community that sees beyond the noise and celebrates the voices determined to change the conversation. Because here, the mockery never wins. The truth does. This is Liberty Leak, and the truth always gets the last word.